International news now.
So to set the stage, let's consider why this conflict matters so much right now and why we're so focused on it. Right. So the U.S.-Venezuela confrontation is unfolding against the backdrop of shifting global alliances, economic uncertainty, think about the tariff conflict and trade wars, and rising transnational threats. But the crisis is not just about drugs and the political risks posed by drug cartels. It's also about the potential reemergence of U.S. imperialism, the limits of executive power, sovereignty in Latin America, and the role of international law in constraining state behavior. As we move through today's lecture, I encourage you to think about how these issues intersect and what they reveal about the changing nature of international politics. And so we're going to begin with an overview of this escalating conflict and the key developments that have brought us up to this point. And there was a lot of news over the weekend. So over the past few months, the U.S.-Venezuela conflict has intensified in ways that few analysts predicted. I think we can say that this was uncertain, and this wasn't on anybody's bingo card 5 or 6 months ago. Now, the initial phase was focused largely on diplomatic threats and economic sanctions, but the situation has escalated significantly in the last couple of months as the United States has launched a wave of military attacks against drug boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific to disrupt trafficking networks moving drugs from South America to the United States. Specifically, it sounds like moving drugs from Colombia to Venezuela and then into the United States. Now, beginning in early September, these strikes have resulted in approximately 80 fatalities across 20, like I said, now I think it's up to 21 or 22. The New York Times has a counter on this. Separate incidents targeting everything from speedboats to semi-submersible vessels. The U.S. or the Trump administration claims that these operations are essential to stem the flow of drugs into the United States. But critics argue that the strikes often occur in ambiguous legal circumstances, with some vessels reportedly retreating, which raises questions about whether the U.S. is engaging in self-defense, or operating outside U.S. territory in international waters. In fact, all these strikes have been in international waters.
You know, we should pause here for a second and just talk about the framing here, right? I mean, going after illicit drug trafficking is a positive thing for the Trump administration. No one's going to defend the drug cartels and their right to, transport drugs into the United States or anything like that. And so I think that is part of the story is that it's difficult, I would say, to oppose these strikes for, say, the Democratic Party, especially because it could be used against it in the future elections by saying they're weak on, the drug crisis or things like that. And so keep that in mind.
Yeah, and partly too, if to critics coming and saying, well, you're shooting these boats out of the water, and then the response in public debates is, so we're supposed to give drug traffickers the rights of due process.
Right. And it's not an easy argument to make publicly, right? Is that, well, where's the congressional authorization? And there's all of that does start to become this noise that's easily countered with, look, we're trying to stop the flow of drugs, right? And so.
And we'll talk about this shortly, but estimates are, right, we're talking about 100,000 on average, right around 100,000 overdose deaths a year.
Right. It's not it's a huge crisis in the United States, right? Yeah. And so there's that element to it.
Yeah. And the question is it a national security crisis? And this is right. Well, or is it a different type of law enforcement crisis?
And and that's the thing that we'll have to get into is the debate here isn't about whether you should try to stop the flow of drugs into the United States. It's rather should you engage in military actions that are in international, waters against, other countries, and what about all the checks that we have in the War Powers Act and everything else that should constrain that?
And in terms of grand strategy, should you be moving an aircraft carrier group to do this?
Right. So, exactly. So that's again my little pause.
That's okay. All good.
Yeah. All right. So The Trump administration's official justification centers on counter-narcotics, like we just talked about, and the role of Venezuela's president, Maduro, in facilitating drug shipments to the United States. And here is an important point to make. It is important to note that the Southern District of New York, that the court secured a federal indictment against Nicolas Maduro in March of 2020, alleging that he engaged in narco-terrorism through his leadership of a trafficking cartel, the Cartel of the Suns, that facilitated the flow of cocaine from Colombia to Venezuela and then to the United States. President Trump has publicly stated that he thinks Maduro's days in office are numbered, although he did open the possibility of new diplomatic talks with Maduro on Sunday evening. Regional actors such as Colombia and Brazil have voiced opposition to the United States military intervention. Colombia, in particular, has suspended intelligence sharing with the U.S. in protest of the strikes, highlighting some regional fallout of the crisis. On Sunday, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, moved to classify the Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, this designation is important because it provides the administration with a legal rationale for expanded military action, invoking authorities typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. The move has sparked debate among legal scholars and members of Congress who question both the effectiveness of this kind of approach, using military against this threat, and its legality. The most visible military part of this escalation was the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to the Caribbean last week, a move that signaled both a show of force and a clear message of the U.S. resolve. The United States means business here. It's spending money and moving troops into harm's way. All of these are sunk costs that clearly send a message of resolve. So let's pause here and run a recent CBS Evening News clip that provides a succinct summary of the latest developments.
And thank you for joining us on this Sunday. We begin with a powerful display of American military might and what the Trump administration insists is a counter-drug operation. Today, the world's biggest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, arrived in the Caribbean Sea. It is now also in striking distance of Venezuela. Today, new video of the latest U.S. attack on a small boat suspected of transporting drugs. So far, at least 80 people have been killed. CBS's Charlie D'Agata in San Juan, Puerto Rico, leads us off tonight.
So U.S. officials tell us that the Ford aircraft carrier crossed into the Caribbean this morning along with 3 guided missile destroyers, part of its strike group, just adding to this massive U.S. military buildup not seen here in decades. The largest and most advanced warship in the world is now in America's most active battle zone. On board 4 dozen F-18 fighter jets, along with technology to jam radars on potential bombing runs. In St. Croix, we saw firsthand how the Ford's presence is adding to a buildup of military assets already on patrol in the Caribbean.
The USS Lake Erie is a guided missile cruiser. It pulled up to dock here in St. Croix a few days ago to resupply and get the sailors on board some much-needed R&R.
While some of the island's residents welcomed visiting sailors and Marines, John and Heidi Driscoll told us the ship's arrival left them feeling unsettled.
Our local businesses can use everything they can, but it still worries me.
Why does it worry you?
I don't know what's going on. The fact that they're here, they're so close to Venezuela, it makes me very nervous. And when you speak to them, they don't know what's going on.
As the U.S. military buildup gathers pace,
peace, peace, peace.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro used music to try and ease tensions.
Imagine us people.
Back in Puerto Rico, we found a naval station that was shut down in 2004, now fully operational with F-35 stealth fighter jets.
So the Trump administration says this is still a drug interdiction operation. They're calling it Operation Southern Spear. But with all this U.S. military hardware in the region,
there are plenty of options to widen that operation.
So the arrival of the Ford Carrier Group has raised the stakes considerably here. The U.S. has increased its naval presence and the range of military assets, including both fighter planes and missiles that could be used to target cartel operations, both at sea and on land in Venezuela. The video notes that the U.S. now has moved 4 dozen fighter jets and radar jamming equipment to the region. The Venezuelan government responded last week by mobilizing 200,000 soldiers or preparing them for conflict by conducting training exercises. Also note how the video uses an interview with locals to inject uncertainty into the present crisis. Now, true, American troops aren't going to tell the locals on the ground what's going, but this is an important element, and we just want to point out here, is an important element in the broader crisis. President Trump's goals here are a bit uncertain. Will the U.S. go to war? Is this just a counterterrorism operation? If it's just limited to targeting cartel boats, then why deploy the most modern aircraft carrier group to the region? Alternatively, is the administration preparing for more extensive military operations inside Venezuela? And if so, will they just target cartel assets, or will they target the Venezuelan military and Venezuelan infrastructure in an effort to try and destabilize the regime and drive Maduro from power?
Okay, now we want to spend some more time examining the potential political objectives of the Trump administration to understand the broader context of this crisis in U.S.-Venezuela relations. Again, the administration has consistently characterized these military actions as drug interdiction efforts designed to dramatically decrease the flow of illegal narcotics to the United States. Trump's advisors have described these drug flows as a threat to national security, given the large number of drug overdose deaths in the United States, which can total over 100,000 deaths per year. Now, note that this is an expansive definition of national security, focusing on the threat to the civilian population that stems from illicit criminal activities rather than those posed by another government or its military. So it's not a classic military invasion or even a threat of invasion from Venezuela that we're trying to combat, or even a threat of a terrorist attack, right, as we saw in previous military interventions, right? However, the administration has tried to link the alleged criminal activities of the Venezuelan government and its military to justify the escalation of the military confrontation with Venezuela. An important element of this strategy, or at least the political and legal strategies for its implementation, is, again, the 2020 federal indictment of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro for narco trafficking. This indictment occurred in Trump's first term and was overseen by his then Attorney General Bill Barr. That indictment accused Maduro of leading the Cartel of the Suns, which is a criminal organization allegedly responsible for orchestrating vast narcotics trafficking operations targeting the United States. It argued that this cartel managed the shipment of cocaine and other illegal substances out of Colombia and into the United States, sometimes allowing drug suppliers safe haven in Venezuela to avoid counter-narcotics operations coordinated between the United States and Colombia.
So the indictment was a watershed moment, marking the first time a sitting head of state in the Western Hemisphere was formally charged with drug trafficking by the U.S. government. The allegations against Maduro and his associates are sweeping. They're accused of using state resources, so using military operations, state resources, to facilitate the movement of cocaine through Venezuela, with the proceeds funding both the regime and allied criminal organizations. More broadly, they accuse Maduro of fusing a criminal operation to the Venezuelan state, including its military, to create a narco state. Accordingly, the Trump administration does not recognize the Maduro government as the legitimate government of the Venezuelan state. This implies that it does not recognize the sovereign authority of the Venezuelan government, and this denial of its political legitimacy is part of a larger political strategy by the administration that's designed to justify the potential removal of Maduro from power. a threat that has been made more credible by the deployment of the aircraft carrier group to the region. And so this narrative, this fusion of political and military power in the Venezuelan state with the narcotic operations, accordingly with the cartel of the Suns, has been instrumental in justifying a wide range of U.S. actions, from economic sanctions to military strikes. So by portraying the Venezuelan government as complicit in drug trafficking and terrorism, the United States has sought to legitimize military intervention and rally domestic political support inside the U.S. for more ambitious military actions. The framing also serves to isolate Maduro internationally, painting his regime as a criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate government. So the narrative of narco-terrorism is used not only to justify military strikes, but also then support broader efforts to disrupt the flow of drugs and dismantle criminal networks. The intersection of narco-terrorism and regime change is a defining feature of the current crisis. By linking Maduro to the cartel, the administration has created a powerful narrative that conflates criminal activity with political illegitimacy, right? The approach has provided both the rationale and the impetus for the dramatic escalation we've witnessed in recent months. And so we can see a coordinated political strategy on the part of the administration here. However, it's also generated significant controversy, with critics arguing that it risks escalating the conflict and undermining the prospects for peaceful resolution. The strategy is not without risks. The conflation of criminal and political objectives can complicate diplomatic efforts and increase the likelihood of unintended escalation. Here, regional actors, including Colombia and Brazil, have expressed concern about the potential for broader conflict and the impact on regional stability. We noted this already. An important break with the United States. The president of Colombia halted the coordination of counter-narcotics operations between the United States and the Colombian governments last week to protest U.S. military operations in the region. I should say this was a costly signal by the Colombian president, because Colombia relies heavily on U.S. military and intelligence capacities for its own counter-narcotics activities. And so in a sense, the cutting off of this collaboration is hurting Colombia in its own local attempts to counter narcotics. But we can argue, and I saw an interview of a human rights scholar that specializes in Colombia, and she was talking about this. This is a costly signal. The Colombian president is hurting the rule of law in Colombia, but he's trying to signal to Trump and the rest of the world how significant this overreach is.
Now, one thing we should note is that the United States government has long disliked the Maduro government in Venezuela. It's not like the Trump administration adopted a new policy in opposition to the Maduro government. The Maduro government was seen as illegitimate and illegally seized power and pushed out its rivals, and is in a leftist authoritarian state, right? And the Biden administration didn't want to cooperate with the Maduro government either. And so just to make sure that there's been a long, complicated relationship between the United States and Venezuela, and it's always been pretty hostile ever since Chavez, and for decades, right? And so there's a lot of deep-seated mistrust between these two countries. And this is just the latest form of that.
And the framing, we should say, right, what we're trying to emphasize here is the framing of this conflict in U.S. interest is both a political strategy in the United States to build up U.S. political support. It's an international strategy, too, to try to isolate Maduro. But there's also important the classification on Sunday, right, that this is Maduro is the head of a cartel, and that cartel is a terrorist organization. This is also laying the legal foundations for greater military strikes, right? But those issues, we're going to talk about them now. They're still subject to debate.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to move to discussing some of the legal and constitutional issues raised by the use of military force in these counter-narcotics operations, and the potential military escalation against Venezuela. And this is where it gets pretty complicated, and the Trump administration is on shakier ground, right? It's pretty easy to defend trying to interdict drug trafficking, but the constitutional issues about how much power the executive branch has to just do whatever it wants with the U.S. military is really contested. So these controversies, these arguments illustrate some of the broader issues we have discussed on U.S. foreign policy in this semester, including which branch of government, the president or Congress, can legally authorize military action against another state, and the declining willingness of Congress to act as a check on executive authority when it comes to deploying military force to advance U.S. global political objectives. Remember, when we went over the role of Congress, the answer was always that Congress has been failing to fulfill its constitutional duties here because it just has delegated or just let the president take military action without much check on its power, right? So the legality of the U.S. military strikes against alleged Venezuelan cartel vessels is one of the most contentious aspects of the current crisis. The War Powers Act requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours when the president unilaterally deploys U.S. military forces into armed hostilities. The first drug boat strikes, military strikes, against Tren de Aragua occurred on September 2nd. Tren de Aragua had already been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. The president submitted this notification to Congress, the notification in line with the War Powers Act, on September 4th, so within that 48 hours. The president justified U.S. military actions in terms of self-defense, writing in his notification to Congress, "We have now reached a critical point where we must meet this threat to our citizens and our most vital national interest with the United States military force in self-defense." Now, this claim of self-defense was part of a legal strategy to anchor U.S. military actions in international law, which uphold the rights of states and their governments to undertake actions, even military actions, of self-defense. Now, the letter argued that the administration relied on the president's Article II constitutional authority as the domestic legal basis for its actions. And it stated, "I," meaning President Trump, "in providing this report as part of my efforts to keep the Congress fully informed, consistent with the War Powers Resolution. And I directed these actions consistent with my responsibility to protect Americans and the United States interests abroad and in furtherance of United States national security and foreign policy interests, pursuant to my constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive to conduct United States foreign relations." So he's acknowledging that he has some constraints here. He's reporting to Congress as he's obliged to by the War Powers Resolution, but then he also says that he's just defending the United States as Commander-in-Chief, and so he's allowed to do that.
And I should note, and I can't remember if we talk about it later or not, so that was on September 4th. In late October, a lawyer from the Department of Justice sent a memo to Congress and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we don't think the War Powers Resolution applies to this crisis because we're using drones to strike the cartels, and because we're using drones, this is a different type of hostilities, and American troops aren't in harm's way, and so we don't think the War Powers Act applies here." And oh, by the way, the Obama administration did the same thing with its 2011 attacks in Libya. So stay tuned, complicated legal issues. But in part they're saying, we consulted you, we notified you, we're continuing to keep you in the loop, but oh yeah, we don't think we legally have to do it.
The reason they are starting to do this is because there's further constraints applied by the War Powers Act where they have to get an authorization to use military force, and they don't really want to do that. And they're not alone, right? All the other presidents who wanted to use military force and sustain that use of military force just said, well, you know what, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force against Al-Qaeda now applies to ISIS. And that was, and again, you read articles, we gave lectures about how that is really shaky. Well, this is even shakier because we're in a whole different part of the world. This is narco trafficking. This, they would it's hard to imagine using some old AUMF, and so they'd have to get an AUMF, but they would have a hard time getting one.
Well, and it's interesting that you raise this because there's some, and the administration hasn't done this yet, but the conversation is in the larger public square is, by calling these cartels terrorist organizations, are they trying to set up legal grounds to invoke the 2001 AUMF? Again, then you've got to find a connection between Al-Qaeda and these. But this is part of the backdrop for then why it's significant that Rubio says the Cartel of the Suns is a terrorist organization as well. The other thing I should point out, I'm glad you raised this, on the rules of the War Powers Act, basically you get 60 days once you notify the Congress, and this is why the DOJ lawyer went to Congress at the end of October, because that 60-day window was expiring on November 2nd. Again, we'll transition here. We want to talk about this, about Congress here in a second. It's unclear whether Congress really wants to do anything about this, right?
They never do.
They never do, in
so
part
why
because...
would they want to do something about this?
Yes,
this is
because,
a pretty...
and again, why don't they? Because they don't want to take the heat if something goes bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why are these attacks unique and how has Congress responded? First, it's important that the strikes occurred in international waters. Therefore, they are no longer just domestic law enforcement actions, instead raising complex issues associated with the rights of foreign actors to have access to legal mechanisms to challenge the legal authority of the administration to act outside of the territorial boundaries of the United States here. Quite simply, is the United States, and this is one of the larger legal questions, violating the human rights of people on these boats by denying them due process? Are they armed combatants under the laws of war? Second, the administration states that it's engaging in self-defense here, but are the cartels waging a coordinated military attack against the United States? Note again that this is an expansive definition of national self-defense. If the boats are hundreds of miles away from the United States, are they still a threat or an imminent threat? Also note that there's some evidence that some of these boats were turning around when they were struck. And so if that's the case, were they attacking the United States then?
Now, of course, there's also news reports that some of these people who were killed in these attacks weren't drug traffickers at all, but fishermen and things like that. And they're bringing suit or want to challenge in court the deaths of these people too. Yeah. So,
third, and it's interesting. We talked about this before. Politically, it's interesting because we can all see images of these, right? This is on the tracker, so we see the explosions, but the background, the legal conversations, the identity of the people and all this, the hearing of the courts, that's not going on. And the larger question is, will this stuff be handled in legal terms, or is this simply going to be treated again as an act of war? And this is the third point we want to raise here. Are these acts of war? And if so, does Congress need to authorize war against the cartels or war against the Venezuelan state, given that Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution explicitly states that Congress shall have the power to declare war? Note that the administration, in the thing that Rob read, recognized the legality of the War Powers Resolution in its notification to Congress on September 4th. But again, the DOJ has said, well, we don't think the War Powers Act applies here, and so because U.S. servant members aren't in danger from these hostilities. But again, that question could get switched, given that the DOJ lawyers are saying this at the end of October. It's one thing if you're using drones to take out cartel boats, but now all of a sudden if you're using aircraft carrier groups to launch strikes into Venezuela, that argument goes out the window.
Right, and then, that's one of the sunk costs of moving these aircraft carriers. If there was any sort of attacks, and then casualties of American soldiers, then of course that changes the whole thing. Okay, so Congress's response to the administration's legal rationale has been marked by frustration, division, and a series of legislative efforts aimed at constraining executive power. So lawmakers have introduced resolutions to require congressional authorization for military strikes. There have been members of Congress that invoked the War Powers Resolution and demanded greater transparency from the administration. The administration has responded to these demands with a series of classified briefings. So they have then given more information to certain members of Congress. However, Democratic members of Congress have frequently been left out of these briefings, which is
Not surprising.
yeah, not surprising, but it does raise larger political frustrations and questions about the partisan nature of the constitutionally mandated consultations with Congress when using military force outside of the United States. The Senate attempted to force President Trump to seek congressional authorization for its military actions against the cartels. That effort was led by Democratic Senators Adam Schiff from California and Tim Kaine from Virginia, who sought to block the administration from using military force without first securing congressional authorization. Senator Kaine argued that the Trump administration's military actions were plainly unconstitutional. Now, the Senate defeated that resolution on a vote of 48 to 51 against, on October 8th, and this was largely along partisan lines. Now, there were a few defectors, right? The Republican senators Rand Paul of Kentucky and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska voted with the Democrats, and Democratic Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania voted with the Republicans. Now, note how this vote about whether Congress itself should be interjecting itself into the decision to use military force reinforces arguments that we discussed earlier in the semester about how party polarization has prevented Congress from undertaking its primary constitutional responsibilities in the making of U.S. foreign policy, namely authorizing the use of military force against international actors. So one might think, theoretically at least, that all members of Congress might have an interest in standing up for Congress's role in making decisions about the use of military force, since that's what's in the Constitution. But it's been divided here across partisan lines.
All right, so in the last part of the lecture, we want to draw on the logic of the bargaining model to understand the escalation of this military crisis between the United States and Venezuela. This framework pushes us to examine how states use costly signals to communicate resolve and shape the outcome of international confrontations. The deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Group and the launch of Operation Southern Spear are classic examples of what scholars and what we've talked about as sunk cost signals. By investing significant resources in military operations, the U.S. administration is sending a clear message to both domestic and international audiences. It's willing to bear substantial costs to achieve its objectives in Venezuela. These maneuvers are not just about immediate tactical gains, they're also designed to pressure the Maduro regime and signal that the U.S. is prepared to escalate further if its demands are not met. The movement of naval assets, the public announcement of new operations, and the visible readiness for land strikes all serve as bargaining tools. They are intended to influence the strategic calculus of adversaries and third parties, reducing uncertainty about U.S. resolve while pressuring Maduro to make significant concessions, perhaps even leaving office. So we want to run a couple of news clips to help us explore these issues. The first examines how the deployment of the Ford Carrier Group to the region suggests a significant escalation in U.S. strategy here, one that's prepared to expand the conflict to include targets on land in Venezuela. So let's run that clip.
Begin with the escalating military action surrounding Venezuela. We're hearing about a new narco sub-strike, and multiple sources are telling CBS News President Trump has been presented with potential plans for a land strike. The new strike was the 20th U.S. military operation targeting suspected drug boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. The defense secretary said this is part of what is now called Operation Southern Spear. CBS News Pentagon reporter Eleanor Watson joins us from our D.C. bureau to give us all the latest. Ellie, great to see you this Friday. Why is the U.S. increasing its military presence near Venezuela, and what options is the president being provided for potential action?
Well, Errol, good morning. CBS reported yesterday that earlier this week there was a meeting at the White House where the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the top U.S. military officer, presented President Trump with options for Venezuela, including, as you mentioned, land strikes. That meeting comes as the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and its escort ships are headed to join the growing armada already off of the coast of Venezuela. The Ford and the 3 destroyers along with it together add not only fighter aircraft, but also dozens of Tomahawk missiles that have the range to strike inside Venezuela. If the president gives the order for that option, that would be a major escalation, making good on his threats over the past several weeks that land strikes could be next.
And Venezuela has threatened its own response to this increased U.S. military presence. Tell us about that. And now we know that this operation has a name from the Defense Secretary, Operation Southern Spear. What is it all about?
Well, earlier this week, you're right, Errol, Venezuela announced that in the face of this growing U.S. pressure that Venezuela was going to do several days of exercises with around 200,000 troops. The stated mission is to be a response, to be a deterrent to the U.S. The Operation Southern Spear, that now has an official name, is kind of a wrap-up of what the U.S. military has already been doing in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific that, at the very least, has been a pressure campaign against Maduro, who President Trump has made no secret he doesn't want to see as Venezuela's president for much longer. Operation Southern Spear, the U.S. military has, since September, been striking boats in the Caribbean and now the Eastern Pacific. At least 20 strikes targeting 21 vessels, bringing the death toll to 80, at least 80 individuals. I should note, Errol, that those strikes initially targeted boats from Venezuela, but since then we've learned that the individuals on board are not just from Venezuela, but also Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. The land strikes, though, would be a major shift in this operation if that's what happens next.
All right, so let me point out a few things in this clip. First, the United States is seriously considering striking at targets inside Venezuela. Now note the dramatic increase in military assets, including fighter planes and missiles, that would increase the range of military options the United States could deploy. President Trump was presented with options to launch expanded strikes against Venezuela last week in the White House. The fact that this was released means the administration is seriously considering these options and are trying to signal that resolve to Venezuela. This would be a significant escalation of the conflict there, moving from explicitly targeting cartel operatives at sea to state targets within Venezuela. These would be acts of interstate war. So the United States is signaling its resolve, trying to pressure Venezuela or its president, Nicolas Maduro, to make concessions in this crisis that might include Maduro leaving office. Thus, the U.S. is using sunk cost signals, the movement of military assets, to reduce uncertainty or reduce private information so as to facilitate a peaceful compromise, but that peaceful compromise would include Venezuelan concessions.
And I should note too, last night Trump said, had a statement suggesting that, we think Maduro might want to talk now, or we'd be signaling that the U.S. might be open to talking here.
Okay,
so,
and that talking might then be some sort of negotiated.
Perhaps. It was very kind of like general and maybe even a throwaway line, but anyway, so.
All right, second, note that Venezuela is trying to send its own sunk cost signals. It took some action, right? Mobilized 200,000 troops to engage in military exercises. Now, we might think about these signals as providing information about the ability of the Venezuelan military to impose costs on U.S. military forces. There is a huge imbalance in forces between the two states, the United States with its huge military, and Venezuela, which has a much smaller military, and we'll hear more about that in the next video. So, Venezuela isn't necessarily trying to communicate that it will win the war, but it might be trying to deter the United States from escalating military attacks by providing information about its military capacity to impose some sort of costs on the U.S. Thus, we can see these exercises as designed to reveal private information about the costs the United States would pay to launch its attacks. So let's now move on to the second clip from Bloomberg News.
What do we know about what's leading up to this report? How did we get to this point in time?
Well, Tyler, we've seen since August this accumulation of U.S. assets in the southern Caribbean. In early September, we saw the first of these strikes, which have now killed about 75 alleged criminals, alleged drug runners in the southern Caribbean, and also expanded to the Pacific. And we're seeing just now the aircraft carrier Ford arriving to the southern Pacific. And so this is the greatest accumulation of assets we've seen at any point in this process that's been going on for several months now. And a lot of speculation. The president has spoken to the idea about whether the cartels need to be hit on land in addition to the boats that have been blown out of the water so far by the U.S. And so a lot of attention on this was with Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday in Canada at the G7 foreign ministers meeting. He said that his counterparts didn't raise this in meetings, but we know that, for instance, the French foreign minister raised questions about the legality of these strikes to the press. And Secretary Rubio responding that they are protecting the U.S., they are protecting the citizens who have seen hundreds of thousands of people killed by fentanyl overdoses in the last number of years, and that these are foreign terrorist organizations, drawing a line saying we're used to people making the argument that to be a terrorist, it needs to be ideological, but that terrorism isn't necessarily ideological, and that this is terrorism in terms of what this has been doing, disrupting so many hundreds of thousands of lives and killing so many people.
You mentioned the idea of potential land attacks, airstrikes, presumably. The United States has a lot of experience with over-the-horizon operations here. Why would we need the biggest aircraft carrier in our arsenal? The strike group that comes with it means an enormous amount of firepower off the coast of Venezuela. What else would we use it for?
Well, Joe, certainly what analysts have talked about is what this show of force means. Yeah. It's been a long time since we've seen these kinds of assets deployed in the Western Hemisphere and near South America. But maybe this is something that we should be becoming more used to, given the priority of the Trump administration on the hemisphere and on stopping drugs. Secretary Rubio yesterday talked about the cooperation and that the U.S. is getting from Mexico on the issue of fentanyl. And one of the reasons that these strikes have needed to happen in the Caribbean is because they're not getting similar cooperation from Nicolas Maduro, who he always reminds us the Southern District of New York has declared to be a drug criminal. And therefore, this idea of an illegitimate government in Venezuela doesn't help the U.S. on stopping drugs, unlike, say, on the U.S. southern border in the land with Mexico, where the Sheinbaum administration has been, and that this is something that needs to be addressed with greater firepower, with direct strikes, because in part of the lack of cooperation.
Well, today, Maduro fast-tracked a bill to strengthen the country's defenses. We have a headline on the terminal that Venezuelans are urged to spy on their neighbors as U.S. warship nears. What do we know about how Venezuela has been responding to what's going on in terms of the U.S. moving assets into the region?
Certainly, we've seen Maduro calling up Venezuelan troops and making very public statements about amassing thousands of Venezuelan troops ready to respond. But in fact, Venezuela has a pretty aged capacity in terms of the aircraft that is available to it, and in terms of the capabilities of the Venezuelan army. They certainly have some ability to defend. But when you talk about the kinds of assets and the sophistication and the technical cutting-edge ability of the U.S. assets that have been put in place in the Southern Caribbean in recent months, certainly the Venezuelan capabilities pale in comparison to the U.S. military.
All right, let's highlight a couple things from the clip. First, note the discussion about how the administration is justifying the strikes. Rubio says that the United States is protecting its citizens. These are acts of self-defense. Second, related to this, they also describe the critical function of the 2020 indictment of Maduro here. The administration is arguing that if he's a criminal, then the U.S. doesn't need to recognize the government of Venezuela as legitimate. Third, the accumulation of military power by the United States is really important here in terms of the content of the signal. By moving these assets to the region, the U.S. is sending signals about the distribution of military power in the region. It's telling, think about this, right, the P in the bargaining model of war. It's telling Venezuela what military resources could be deployed because the U.S. has them in the region. And by shifting these assets, the U.S. is increasing its regional coercive bargaining leverage to try and get a better deal in terms of concessions from Maduro. Okay, let's step back here and try to think slightly in more speculative terms, kind of what's going on here. First, what is Trump really trying to get? Is he going to deploy military troops to Venezuela? And I have to say here, I think I'm skeptical of more extensive military operations here, one that we might associate with regime change, if only because of the legacy of the Iraq War and how that helped to transform the Republican Party, and President Trump benefited politically from it. So we saw a huge backlash huge domestic backlash against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that leads to a reorientation in Republican voters against the neoconservative vision.
Led by Donald Trump.
Yep.
I mean, he was the only Republican candidate in 2016 criticizing the Iraq War, right? It wasn't the whole Republican Party that spontaneously went the other way. It was Donald Trump that criticized George W. Bush, you know.
And so it's very much part of his grand strategy DNA
it's his brand.
To avoid military interventions that are designed to promote domestic regime change.
This is one of the most surprising parts of this, is that he's threatening a forever war. I mean, what do we, you know, if we actually attack Venezuela, would we occupy Venezuela? I mean, are you kidding me?
No way, right? And and the other thing, right, is Republican senators and members of the House have already said, be very careful about how far you go here, because our brand, we don't want to take huge costs in terms of, we don't want to take any costs in terms of military casualties from armed service members, and don't go exposing us in the 26 midterms. Now, so then the question is, if he's not really going to engage in extensive war operation or a war against Venezuela, what's he trying to do? And one of the arguments that's circulating is this is a device to put pressure on Maduro and weaken him at home in Venezuela and encourage the displacement of the Maduro regime, encourage a palace coup from the military to essentially to replace Maduro.
I mean, Maduro's not going to lose an election.
No.
You know, so that's not like on the table here. I mean, Venezuela doesn't have competitive elections. That's why I say that, right? And so it would have to be some sort of military removal of Maduro, right? And so I guess, I mean, again, I'm not sure what usually it all comes back to domestic politics. Like, would Trump really gain a ton by forcing Maduro out of power in Venezuela? There'd be some chaos in Venezuela in that process.
I don't know
risks.
I don't know either. Let's come back to the public opinion stuff that you talked about earlier before we went on camera. So you can make an argument, I think, but I don't know the data on this one, which is that the U.S. public supports the cartel operations against the cartels, but wouldn't support military operations against Venezuela.
Right. So there's a poll from October, YouGov poll, right? So, you know, legitimate polling organization that had 62% of Americans saying they would be opposed to military action against Venezuela in Venezuela, right? And so there is a strong majority that is currently not in favor of anything like that, even though we've got the Trump administration basically threatening just that with its sunk cost signals, right? A huge aircraft carrier group in the Caribbean, right? And so now in that same survey, you had 62 against. The next highest was 33%, which was don't know, right? And so that's kind of persuadable, but still nothing that would get you to a positive thing. And there was only like 18% that said they would be in favor of that. And so this is a huge gulf here. And so now if you go to lesser military interventions against like drug boats in the Caribbean or some sort of sanctions or anything like that, then it gets more equal. But even then, there's a plurality that is against the United States getting involved in this, right? And so there is a debate out there. There is some, it can't be unacknowledged that people are like, well, maybe this is a distraction. Maybe this is the changing of a subject, right? Because President Trump is facing some domestic pressures here, high cost of living that led to a poor, electoral outcome in the mayoral race in New York City, but also governor races in New Jersey and Virginia, and then the Epstein stuff.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm in the middle of preparing for this lecture last night. Right, we're filming on Sunday night at 10 o'clock, and as I'm preparing, the news ticker headline comes out, Trump says release the Epstein files. He now supports it, right? So in the midst of a huge weekend of news about aircraft carrier groups, about designating the Cartel of the Suns as a terrorist organization, and then, oh yeah, we're going to release, I'm fine with releasing the Epstein files, gets a Sunday night, potentially gets lost in the larger news cycle of Venezuela. Something else let me note about all this is note that there are costs to moving this quantity of military resources to the region. We need to think about these in terms of the opportunity costs of moving these resources to the region, because this is an aircraft carrier group that, because now it's parked off the coast of Venezuela, can't be deployed in other, arguably more potentially dangerous strategic theaters or more pressing strategic theaters, like in Europe, i.e. Ukraine, Asia, i.e. China, or the Middle East, i.e. Iran. So anyway, there are costs to this deployment. And one of the arguments is he wouldn't be deploying this amount of firepower to the region if he wasn't planning on using it. And so it might not be a bluff.
Yeah, wow, that's a risky strategy then.
Yeah.
Right? And so, of course, so we just talked about the polls and the difficulty in the domestic coalitions that are in place under Trump now, right? And the sort of natural resistance to any sort of long-standing military engagement, like in Venezuela, or again reminiscent of Afghanistan, Iraq. You name the place that has been critiqued by a core part of the Trump coalition as forever wars, unnecessary, costly, and unproductive, right? And so there's that risk. But one of the other things that has been sort of talked about here is the broader strategy. And maybe we should kind of end with this, is that there was even a term, a label, it was called the Donroe Doctrine, which was a play on words, right, of the Monroe Doctrine, which was a U.S. foreign policy in the early times of the Republic. James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States, declared that the Western Hemisphere was the United States to protect and to sort of be the hegemon over. And the Monroe Doctrine was a very famous and had a long legacy of U.S. intervention in its hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. And now there are some who are talking about a revisiting of the Monroe Doctrine under Donald Trump. And the Monroe Doctrine, he is assembling through sorts of rewards and punishments of leaders across Latin America to either befriend them, give them preferred, policies and lower tariffs and all sorts of support to get them to cooperate with the United States, and then on the other side, punishing other governments that are not in favor, like the Maduro government, pressuring them with the military action, or like in Brazil under Lula, when having sky-high tariffs because they were going to indict an ally of President Trump, Bolsonaro, for election fraud and the like. And so this could be part of a broader strategy to reestablish and deepen American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and that could be a big play.
And block China and Russia from having greater influence, right? And we shouldn't forget, we talked about this before we went on, Maduro has had some meetings with Putin this year, and so this is in a sense a denial of coalition opportunities between.
I mean, there's still, and there's always this sort of diminishing of the ideological part of this, especially with the Trump administration. The Trump administration, seems to be very transactional, very pragmatic, and isn't swayed by but there is an ideological aspect to this. They're more right. Is the governments that are more populist, that model themselves after the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself. That, the Argentinas, where the president there ran a campaign that said he was going to make Argentina great again, and just tried to copy the playbook of Donald Trump. When the Argentine economy got into trouble, the United States provided a bailout to that country, and that bailout, $20 billion, not only buoyed the Argentine economy, but there were midterm elections right at that time that then helped that populist government retain power, right? And so there's that broader strategy of using the resources that the United States has to gain control and hegemony in the region.
Yeah, and I mean, we could think about this as a larger exercise in coalitional politics, and what's different is that Trump is constructing a new set of coalitions from prior presidents,
rather than Europe, for example, and NATO, right?
Yeah.
And you do have to wonder then if you're going to pour that kind of resources. We keep talking about this huge carrier group, right? If you're going to lock down the Western Hemisphere, are you ceding the other hemispheres to somebody else? And that's another big part of this. Because there's always been this debate about the Trump administration being more comfortable with spheres of influence for everybody, right? For the United States, but also then for China, also then for Russia, and if that becomes the new international order, you've got a very different order than what existed from World War II all the way through to 2025.
So maybe we should leave it there.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're still in a moment. We're still
but
in a moment.
This crisis is a big deal.
Yeah, and it reflects, in some senses, right where we finished here, the larger transition and the larger moment that we find ourselves. So we hope we helped you understand this moment, this transition, and provide some historical background and ways to think about it. This is the last news segment. You've got your final. Reach out to us with questions, and thanks for a good semester.